As I was showing you, we have this information here for Las Cruces and El Paso. But I wanted to take a minute also and talk about the actual particular aspects of licensing money services businesses in New Mexico and Texas. And interestingly, New Mexico now requires that the money service business operators, these are your check cashers, your small loan companies, your currency exchangers, and your money transmitters, to register with the nationwide mortgage licensing system. And that kind of struck me as odd because it's something you hear about usually with mortgages and not something for like money services businesses. Now, what is different between Texas and New Mexico? Texas also requires that the MSBs registers with the NMLS, but except for check cashers. Check cashers in Texas do not have to, small loan companies do not have to register with the NMLS, which is different from New Mexico. The other sort of distinction is that in Texas, the industry is largely unregulated, but companies must register with the OCCC. So in Texas, they don't register with the NMLS. They register with the Texas Office of the Consumer Credit Commissioner. And I thought the Hunt Institute was an awkward title. But they have to register there instead of the NMLS. Now, Texas has no registration fees, interest rates, or loan amount restrictions for these small loan companies and check cashers. New Mexico, on the other hand, is much more regulated, but still, it's not as regulated as Georgia. Apparently, Georgia doesn't even allow small loan companies or check cashers to operate. But New Mexico is making a much stronger push to regulate these companies. But interestingly, not from a law enforcement or financial inclusion or perhaps a public safety point of view, more from a kind of a question of social well-being or social development, because these kinds of institutions are often seen as predatory. So the push to regulate them in New Mexico is not from a law enforcement or national security perspective, but one for a social well-being. In Texas, there was been several initiatives, most I think dramatically in 2013, to provide some kind of regulatory oversight of small loan companies. That did not succeed. There's been other legislative attempts recently, but they have not succeeded either in Texas. Money service businesses, in addition to these small loan companies, your title and your payday lenders, also included money transmitters. And money transmitters are part of this family, and they also provide a critical lifeline for non-banked populations, but also for the criminal element. And so this issue is something that is also under the jurisdiction of Texas and New Mexico. And there are different ways that these states govern this activity again. And what I wanted to show you guys was that to begin with, this is a graph of real remittances to Mexico by type. And as we see, these electronic money transfers for almost the last 20 years have been dominating the types of remittances to Mexico. And it's upwards of $25 billion a year to that country. Now, there's something else that I wanted to mention before we get into money service transmitters more deeply, and that's this program called Directo a Mexico, which is a program sponsored by the Mexican Central Bank to connect bank accounts in Mexico to bank accounts in the United States. This one, yes. By the way, I can make, or this presentation is immediately available to you. I encourage you to send Vic email after email after email, maybe 3 or 4, and he will send you the presentation. And to request this. But this kind of information is immediately available for you in this presentation. But also, as I was mentioning earlier, this is part of a larger banking and finance and national security report that we're doing, which will have even more information and even more data in the coming weeks and months towards the beginning of next year. Also, this presentation is of relatively general applicability. We have people in here from different sectors and at different areas in their sectors. But if there's anything you need to know more about, please let us know as well, and we can happily get that information for you. Okay, so there's this program called Directo a Mexico, and it connects bank account to bank account. And that is, in many ways, advantageous, again, not only from an economic point of view and a financial point of view and a financial system point of view, but also from a national security and a public safety point of view, because you're transferring money from one bank account to the other through this program, and you're going through the formal commercial banking system with your account holders, your account numbers, and you can trace the amounts that are sent. Now, the other advantage of this, and you can go on the website Directo a México, y hay una publicidad, y están hablando de qué tan chido es el programa, and cuánto dinero ahorras por participar. So the costs associated with the transmission of cash or money through Directo a México, those fees are much, much lower than they are for your money service transmitters. So again, we're seeing throughout this presentation not only a relationship between economic activity that's legal and economic activity that's illegal, but we're starting to really see and continually highlight this relationship between financial and market health and also public safety. So this program, I think, is a very good step toward that goal. Now, so Directo a México remittances have been increasing, not only in terms of total transactions, but in terms of the real dollar amounts. And the other thing that's happening with these transactions or transmissions is that the average dollar amount is increasing as well. So I think that in many ways, this is sort of a good news story, or it's something that could really probably be built on. It could be even something like, the Sentry program for interbank operations between Mexico and the United States. So we see a lot of these amounts increasing as well. And it's interesting just to think, the average transaction is almost $8,000, the average transaction. So that's quite a lot of money. In the video that I was talking about, he was talking about sending money to sus jefes. And so I was thinking about, his parents getting $8,000 through this program. So I would like to be that child's father. So getting back now to real remittances in particular, these traditional money transmissions and money services, we did an analysis here of the relative position of Chihuahua as a state relative to other border states, because we want to see, one of the major sort of goals of money laundering between the U.S. and Mexico is to get that cash, that American U.S. dollar cash, into the Mexican financial system. And how does that happen? Bulk cash transfers, property acquisitions. It could happen through trade-based money laundering schemes. It could happen through a variety of ways. But one of the ways that, again, needs to be of concern to us is how money transmitters work. So we can see here sort of where Chihuahua is relative to other cities or other states. And it's interesting also to think about throughout this presentation where Chihuahua is relative to Tamaulipas. We've sort of seen them sort of right next to each other in various different analytical lenses in earlier discussions. And so here they are as well. But look at the spikes in Tamaulipas and also the spike there with Nuevo León, which neighbors Tamaulipas. What was happening there that caused such a spike? And it's those kinds of abnormalities that interest us, not only as market analysts, but also as law enforcement officials. What's the anomaly? What's the red flag? What doesn't fit here? I don't know if you guys have ever played that game. So what we also did was we did this analysis with respect to real remittances at the municipal level on the U.S.-Mexico border. And again, you'll see that in the last slide and this slide as well, we do both relative as well as absolute analysis. So here we have the remittances to Ciudad Juarez in absolute terms over the last 4 years, more or less, but then how they relate to other border cities in Mexico. And interestingly, Tijuana gets a lot more remittances than Ciudad Juarez, almost more than 2 times. But Reynosa in Tamaulipas, where we saw that spike, also is consistent with that spike from the prior slide. So something's happening there, something happened there that caused that, and I think it would be worthwhile to investigate further. Then we also have real remittances to border cities versus the rest of Mexico. So this is another one of those kind of, relative analyses of where things are. So the real remittances or remittances to Mexico have been increasing, strongly, even these last 3 years. But to border cities, there's been some spikes there, but if you take an average line through that, it over time, I think, kind of smooths out. So something's happening where remittances are increasing to the rest of Mexico, but they're sort of fluctuating around some kind of average point to Mexican border cities. What we also did, and this is something that we're really interested about and something that I think my staff and students would have a headache if they heard it one more time. But what we really try to do at the Institute is get local regional data. We try to really understand what's happening in Juarez, what's happening in Las Cruces, what's happening in Juarez, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we have here is we have information about the amount of remittances that are going to cities within Chihuahua and to the state. So at the state level, Chihuahua has seen a pretty dramatic increase in remittances over the last 4 years. As well as Ciudad Juarez, up to $50 million. Now, the other thing is that we don't just look at these, again, as I was saying earlier, when we were discussing real deposits in New Mexico and the border counties, we don't just do that for major cities. We also try to look at the outlying areas. And we have remittance data to these places like Alhama, Chihuahua. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's not, a major international gateway, but it's important to understand how that money is influencing the region as a whole and perhaps that municipality in particular. We've also done the same with Casas Grandes, Chihuahua. And this is interesting because as law enforcement officers, you know that this city, Casas Grandes, is very important for a lot of reasons. And it's important with respect to the Mennonite community. It's important with respect to the agricultural sector, to migratory flows, to smuggling flows. And what happened here in Casas Grandes that there was such a precipitous decline over a 2-year period in remittances. So hopefully, whether you're a banker in Juarez or Mexico, or whether you're a law enforcement officer at EPIC, or whether you're working with Department of Justice in Washington, hopefully these kinds of data points and these kinds of analyses can help fill out the picture to what you're trying to understand and what you're trying to dismantle and disrupt. Because as I was saying earlier, I really know how busy things can get and how quickly a day goes by. So all this kind of information is here to help you with your casework. So now this section of the presentation is going to get into particular discussion of illicit activity, the data around illicit activity in our region, and how the governments are structured to combat that. This is a relatively well-known map that was published several years ago in a newspaper. And I use it really for illustrative purposes. And I know I was teasing and joking with you guys about wanting to be a cartographer, but I think maybe I already am. I mean, maybe I just am in love with it so much that I can't deny it. So this map is trying to recall again where we started with the very first slide of our presentation, and the maps that we'll be seeing here in a moment with respect to our region. And earlier I was talking about the economic structures of the United States, the economic and political values of the United States, and how that yielded such a strong, dynamic market that the world really has never seen, and that continues to be the strongest, most dynamic market to this day. So everything wants to sort of get into the US market, whether that's legally or illegally. And they want to satisfy market demand in the United States. And as I was saying earlier, from a north-south perspective, there's only a few really viable ways to get those kinds of things into the United States or out of the United States. And from a terrestrial point of view, you have even fewer. And this Paso del Norte region is your most viable route. I mean, the Spaniards knew it hundreds of years ago, and the Native American communities knew it even before then. So what that means is, just to put it kind of in perspective, is that we're literally on the front lines of this kind of activity. We're on the front lines of these kinds of pressures. We're on the front lines of any kind of binational activity you wish to think of, whether it's natural gas pipelines, whether it's human smuggling, whether it's transboundary aquifers, whether it's supply chains and car parts and the aerospace sector. Everything has to come through us. It reminds me of Charon and the ancient Greek myth that, you had to pay the riverman. You had to pay the riverman to get across. So everything's coming across here. But as we'll see in a minute, not always do our institutions have a strong awareness of this binational activity from a broad, unified perspective. So I want to start talking about the anti-money laundering regime writ large, and sort of where it came from and where it is and what's happening. So way back when, in 1989, this group of wealthy countries with advanced financial and banking systems, advanced financial and banking systems, got together and created the Financial Action Task Force. And the Financial Action Task Force is headquartered in Paris. Again, another city that knows our community very well, I'm sure. And the idea behind the Financial Action Task Force was to create voluntary guidelines at an international level that could be implemented by national governments. So you could have a kind of harmonized structure of not only anti-money laundering rules and laws, but operational mechanisms. A lot of the work that you guys were doing with law enforcement, with the DOJ, with ICE, with CBP. Now, these are voluntary, and so there's not a treaty with respect to this. There's not something that mandates that the countries that participate here have to adopt these rules. Now, the Financial Action Task Force has been working also with respect to something we haven't talked a lot about today, which is terrorist financing. And so the Financial Action Task Force doesn't just really have its origin with drug trafficking and illegal sources of money for commercial purposes, but also with terrorist financing, particularly after September 11th. And so these regulations now are used to sort of debilitate illegal money laundering schemes that would benefit both terrorist organizations or transnational criminal organizations. So the Financial Action Task Force sets standards to promote effective legal and regulatory implementation and the operational measures to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. And the Financial Action Task Force has developed a series of recommendations that are the standard for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. And these recommendations were most recently revised in 2012. So this group meets often, and it has geographical subgroups within it. Now, the other thing that the Financial Action Task Force does is it sort of is like a minder. It's like a nanny. And so it will go around and send delegations to the different countries and basically do a scorecard or a report card. How's Mexico doing? How's Canada doing? How's the US doing? How's England doing? And then they publish all these things, and you can read them and look at them on their website. Now, the alternative to that, or something that's really, not the alternative, but the counterpart to that, is something that is really at the core of what the Hunt Institute is doing. It's at the heart of why we all came here together today, and this is called information sharing. And information sharing is of critical importance, again, not only for private sector economic development, but also for public safety and national security. So there's this thing called the Edgemont Group, and it's based in Brussels, another city that knows us very well, and is a sort of brotherhood or a fraternity of financial intelligence units. And we'll get into that in a second. But it's a collection of these financial intelligence units from each participating country, and there's 155 that participate. And they get together and not only share information, but they also provide a platform for the secure exchange of expertise and financial intelligence. So it has a very, actually, I think, much more practical mechanism associated with combating money laundering and terrorist financing than FATF. Even though FATF is good about creating the political will and the importance of strong regulatory and law enforcement mechanisms. So the Edgemont Group in its statement says that it recognizes that the sharing of information is of paramount importance and has become the cornerstone of international efforts to counter money laundering and terrorist financing. And when I read that, it really resonated with me because as an institute that works in the region, as an individual who lives here, I find that this sort of opacity that exists across this region between New Mexico, Texas, and Chihuahua, this uncertainty, these cloudy sort of skies, is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for us. And if you think about how we could come together and work as a region to come up with really innovative or strong cross-border information sharing platforms, or just understanding the different market structures that exist here in the region, then we could be of value and use to the broader binational perspective. So it's something that is a real opportunity for us that I think we can take advantage of. So, you can find inspiration in a quote from Edgemont Group if you look hard enough. So now with respect to the Mexican structure of the anti-money laundering enterprise, again, we see these usual suspects because in Mexico, the regulators are relatively few and they have a large portfolio. So Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público also, which is the agency that is not in charge of, but is the sort of parent of the Comisión Nacional Bancaria, works to ensure the integrity of the financial system. So they have all the data, Comisión Nacional. They're the ones who work to make sure that there's no anomalies in the banking system. And then the Unidad de Inteligencia Financiera, this is your financial intelligence unit, your FIU, for those of you who are familiar with that acronym. They're also part of the Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público. And they're the ones who kind of do investigations. They're the ones who go out and really look at what's happening, but also make sure that the laws are being followed. And then there's this thing in Mexico called the CIEDO. And the CIEDO is the Subprocuraduría Especializada en Investigación de Delincuencia Organizada. And that's part of the PGR, which is the Procuraduría General de la República. Interesting to note that their state headquarters is located in Juárez and not Chihuahua City. So basically the Mexican FBI, you could say, has put their headquarters across the border from us, not down in Chihuahua City. So these are your main actors here. And I want to also take a minute because, as you know, I've expressed my love for regional knowledge and our communities. So I took sort of a deep dive, and I'd like to take you with me there for a moment to talk about sort of the structure of law enforcement in the region and the challenges, but also the opportunities that that presents us with. So if you look at the Mexican law enforcement system or structure, after the federal agencies, you have the Fiscalía General del Estado, the Attorney General for the state of Chihuahua. And it might or may not surprise you to learn that there is no specific or dedicated anti-money laundering or terrorist financing working group or task force at the Attorney General's office for the state of Chihuahua. Now, going back to the difference in legal systems that I was explaining earlier, a lot of those laws in Mexico are federal because the states in Mexico have much weaker sovereignty than they do in the United States. So that's consistent with the political structure. But my point is that I think that it could still be beneficial to have something at the state law enforcement level looking into these things in Chihuahua. Now, at the municipal level in Ciudad Juarez, there is absolutely no task force really specialized in any kind of crime. So, it's important to think about how our local institutions are plugged into these binational, international, sophisticated, innovative money laundering and criminal enterprise activities that course through our region as we speak. And this is something that is not just, present in the Chihuahua side, but also in the New Mexico and El Paso side, as I'll share in a minute. Now, I just also wanted to mention a few things about the Mexican anti-money laundering legal structure. As I said earlier, it follows the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force. Now, that's not to say that all countries that participate in or work with the Financial Action Task Force have the same anti-money laundering laws. They don't. Some have exceptions, some have aberrations, et cetera. And I'll share one of those with you in a minute. But Mexico uses a risk-based approach to dealing with the reporting of suspicious activity. And this is, sort of consistent with your KYC rules, your know your customer rules. So they also participate in that same kind of activity. But I also wanted to mention, because as I said, I always like to share or look at things from a regional point of view. Money transmitters are, again, in Mexico, not regulated. They're not even required to be licensed. So if you think about what that means for the financial stability, but also for law enforcement, you have all these money transmitters in Mexico, and they're not sort of reporting. They have to technically report. They're covered by anti-money laundering rules, reporting of transactions over a certain dollar amount or things like that. But they're not registered ex ante from the beginning. You don't necessarily know, how much money's going through there. You don't know, who's working with this. You don't know the companies behind it and things like that. So it's the same thing with currency changers as well. Only if they deal in a habitual way with customers over $10,000 do they have to be licensed. But there's an exception for the border region. Fíjate. Okay, so, if you're working like in the northern Mexico border, you have this exception because the private sector and the economy in some ways demands that northern Mexico be open to dollar transactions and the exchange of currency between pesos and dollars. So in some ways, Mexico is between a rock and a hard place on this anti-money laundering activity because they need the communities here to participate back and forth between dollars. And in some ways, El Paso needs that as well. I don't know if any of you have been downtown on a weekend on Santa Fe Street or in Cielo Vista, but our retail sector very much needs the economic support from Juarez. So we need to have some kind of flexibility here, but that flexibility can also be quite a peril for not only our regional security, but for binational security. Now, on the U.S. side, again, it's like a zoo of alphabet soup, I guess. But the primary regulators really, I think, coalesce around the Department of Treasury. And the work that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network does, as well as the IRS. Now, I want to say something just quickly here about FinCEN. And it is the financial intelligence unit for the United States. So it's the WEF on the Mexico side, and on the U.S. side, it's FinCEN. And it's responsive. It's responsible for the issuance, administration, and civil enforcement of regulations implementing the Bank Secrecy Act. And if you want to speak, until we fall asleep about the Bank Secrecy Act, I'd be happy to do that with you as well. And it works with other. The thing about the United States is, even though we have a lot of law enforcement mechanisms and a lot of operations, they, I think, strive really hard to work together. So FinCEN works very closely with the IRS and other law enforcement actors here, Office of Criminal Investigation of the IRS, to really find out what's happening with the money flows. There's also, I'm just going to name some of them, principal actors that deal with money laundering here, just to give you an idea of how many there are. There's the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. There's the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crime. There's the Office of Foreign Asset Control, just within the Department of Treasury. And then within the Department of Justice, there's the Asset Forfeiture and Money Laundering section. There's the Counterterrorism section. There's the National Drug Intelligence Center. Then law enforcement agencies at the federal level. There's the DEA and the Office of Financial Crimes, created in 2004. Then there's the FBI. And then within DHS, we have Customs and Border Patrol, and we have ICE. And then we have, as I mentioned earlier, the IRS, Office of Criminal Investigation. So, that is like, stands in stark contrast to what you have in Mexico, even at the federal level, where there's so much singularity with respect to who the regulators are and their operations at the federal level. Now, I want to say something about the DEA, and there's another map. But it's important because, also look, there's nothing below that map. For the time being, there's others that show what's going on there. But I wanted to share this with you just to show you what the DEA El Paso division looks like. And think about this map, again, with respect to all the maps that we've looked at up till now. We looked at the disputed territory map with the Gadsden Purchase and the Pacific Rail Lines and I-10. We looked at the Federal Reserve banks and how those districts split up our region. And now we have the DEA with a different conception of what their area of operation is. And so it's, I think, important to keep that in mind. But the other thing that I think is interesting about this DEA map that I like is that it really looks at our region as a whole. And a lot of times, we feel like we're not understood by Albuquerque. We feel like we're not understood by Austin, certainly not a lot of times by Washington or Mexico City. So what I think is really virtuous about the DEA area of operation here is that it includes the West Texas sector with New Mexico and looks at it as one rather than different units. Now, at the state level, there's the New Mexico Attorney General's office and then the Texas Attorney General as well. Now, both have anti-money laundering sections. But going back to the yellow light analogy, you can't find anything on the New Mexico website other than maybe a paragraph explaining that there is an anti-money laundering section. I couldn't find any people who work on it. I couldn't find, it's my understanding also that the Attorney General has taken the prosecutors from the Las Cruces office and moved them to Albuquerque. So, what kind of institutional capacity do we have here if those kinds of things are happening? And the Texas Attorney General has an anti-money laundering operation that also enforces state and federal anti-money laundering laws, but it's not anything that's specifically related to transnational or binational drug trafficking. Now, getting back to these maps, I wanted to show you the work that the DEA and others are doing through the HIDA program. And the HIDA program provides assistance to federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement to dismantle and disrupt drug trafficking organizations through information sharing, again, the importance of that, and coordinated operational activities. So look at our southern border and see how, what a key gateway it is for high intensity drug trafficking. And then look at New Mexico. And, I don't know if you've heard the stories of Española and Rio Arriba and the heroin epidemic that's been going on there for decades. This is not, part of this new wave of opioid crisis. This is inveterate. And that corridor there in New Mexico mirrors the corridors we've been looking at, these commercial corridors we've been looking at for the whole length of this morning's presentation, going from El Paso and Las Cruces all the way up the Front Range into Colorado. And then even there in the Four Corners area with Farmington and San Juan County. Now, the HIDA program, interestingly, this is a map from the HIDA for New Mexico. And you see the kind of why I wanted to share this with you again is to show you how drug trafficking and illegal economic activity is parallel with legal trade and commerce. And you see how it sort of mirrors those trade routes. And that's for New Mexico. Now, there's a whole, before I get to the Texas part. Now, at the state police office in New Mexico and the Doña Ana County Sheriff's Office and the municipal police in Las Cruces, there's no dedicated task force dealing with money laundering. So at the state level, you're pretty much left to the federal agencies and the federal law enforcement working with state agencies, but the state agencies don't necessarily have the kind of resources, the kind of excellence, the kind of expertise that the federal agencies have. So again, it's from a state law enforcement or a municipal law enforcement or county law enforcement perspective, I think that it's very wise of us to start thinking about how to better strengthen those law enforcement organizations. Now, this is a whole different HIDA. So we have a HIDA for New Mexico, and then we have a HIDA for West Texas. And I'm not part of HIDA, but I imagine that even that kind of separation could provoke some kind of uncertainties or could inhibit to some degree information sharing. So it's interesting to see how these two HIDA corridors are next to each other, but are governed with different structures. And this is an emerging pipeline from the Pacific through Chihuahua, basically our backyard, into West Texas and onto the Midwest and the East Coast and Houston. So again, as trade develops, transnational crime goes with it. Now, the parallel organizations to the New Mexico State Police, County Sheriff, and municipalities are these. And the Department of Public Safety in Texas does have a border crimes division, which is in many ways more than you can say for the New Mexico State Police. And I have 5 minutes left. You guys are sitting in rapt attention. Okay, so I will go quickly through this. But again, the Sheriff's Office and El Paso Police, I think, could benefit a lot from resources and a fully structured anti-money laundering apparatus. So FinCEN map looks like this. And I find it fascinating that the Southwest border region does not include New Mexico. And I'm sure there's a reason for that. I'm not at all, I think that those reasons are strong and sound. But again, I'm just thinking in terms of regionalism, in unified structures, in the flows, in the highways and the rail lines and the migratory flows that go through our region, that I was just expecting something that would be there with New Mexico. But as we see here, this is the high intensity financial crimes area. It's kind of like an analog to HIDA. And these try to really combine state, federal, state, and local law enforcement to pursue and share information and also disrupt criminal organizations through collaboration. Now, what I also wanted to say that there's a lot of other fascinating regional efforts that are taking place in the United States that you don't really see across the border in Mexico. And some of these are the Border Enforcement Security Task Force. All these that I'm about to mention have some kind of jurisdiction for money laundering. The Border Enforcement Security Task Force, the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, the Alliance to Combat Transnational Threats, the Executive Committee for Southwest Border Intelligence and Information Sharing, and the El Paso Intelligence Center. So the United States has a very robust, very sophisticated, very well-financed law enforcement apparatus on here, and even in Mexico and other places where they operate. But as we saw earlier, on the Mexican side, it's much, much more fragile and much less robust. So what I also wanted to mention quickly that's happening sort of at the regional level are agreements between attorneys general in the Southwest border states, including Texas. And that's the Southwest Border Anti-Money Laundering Alliance. And this is a kind of information and law enforcement cooperation mechanism that California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas participate in. Then there's also something, the Conference for Western Attorneys General has created this Alianza Estatal to work with Mexico and Mexico law enforcement to really strengthen a mutual awareness of law enforcement activities and law enforcement priorities in the region. Now, something interesting, as a law student at the University of New Mexico, not only could I not take a course on NAFTA because it was not offered, but I could not even find a course on U.S.-Mexico criminal law or U.S.-Mexico criminal organizations or U.S.-Mexico criminal activity. You cannot study money laundering and these kinds of issues in Albuquerque. And it's very important to think about that because we're so exposed to this, as we've seen, and we'll see in a minute here, that our most important law instructional institutions don't have that kind of vision or orientation. So I think that to the extent we're able to create coursework there or find programs, we'll be stronger not only as a region and as communities, but also as a nation. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly. I'm going to talk about, this is some data on cash seizures. Then we have some data on casinos. And then we have some data on car exports. And then we also have some data on homicides. So if you look at this, this is from Administración General de Aduanas. Cash seizures, the second highest location for cash seizures, bulk cash seizures in Mexico, all of Mexico, Ciudad Juárez. After the, and by quite a stretch too, not neck and neck there, after the Aeropuerto Internacional de la Ciudad de Mexico. Now, these are some cash seizure data that we were able to get from CBP and also from media, from the newspapers. It's hard for us to get data on these kinds of things, I think, for law enforcement reasons, but nevertheless, it starts to present a picture of what's happening here in our region, not only at Isleta, Ibota, and Santa Teresa, but the other ports of entry and how it's coming in or leaving. Now, the thing I wanted to mention about the casinos is that there is in New Mexico a casino right across the border, Sunland Park Casino. And this is a huge threat area for money laundering around the world, casinos. And it's also that we have a casino in Ruidoso in Otero County, which is not far from here as well. So, you know, what is happening with our casinos in the region is important to think about. Now, interestingly, just to go back again to Financial Action Task Force and Juarez and the Mexican legal system, Mexican law prohibits casinos, but there are casinos operating legally in Mexico through something called the amparo. And the amparo is a legal mechanism where you ask the court to prevent the enforcement of a law while that case is basically resolved. It's kind of like an injunction, but it happens on a case-by-case basis. So Ciudad Juarez actually has functioning active casinos, but they're not regulated. They're prohibited in Mexican law. And then on top of that, the casinos or the kind of betting apparatuses that are allowed in Mexico law are not governed by their AML provisions, and they're not licensed and they're not regulated. So, that's something that the Financial Action Task Force mentions in its report on Mexico, is that kind of threat area. Now, so with New Mexico gaming and license, and Texas does not allow casinos. So we have this state to the south of us that doesn't allow casinos but does have casinos. And then we have a state to the north that allows casinos and does have casinos. And then we have a state to the east that doesn't allow casinos. And, what's going on with respect to that? And so here we got a lot of data from the New Mexico Gaming Commission to try and understand, what's going on, not only with their development over time, but also the type of operators there are and the machines that are there. And then we also try to get some information about how well they're doing financially by looking at their tax revenue over years. And interesting, 2018 isn't finished yet, but the taxes that have been paid from 2010 to 2017 show a relatively stable amount with a small decrease here in 2017. We'll see where that happens, as we finish the year. Now, all of you are very familiar probably with the FinCEN website and the SARs. So what we also did was we tried to get a sense of what kind of SARs were coming out of the casinos here. And unless we pressed the wrong button or downloaded the wrong Excel sheet, we found no SARs for casinos in Doña Ana County, which I don't know how that could be, but it is. And then with Bernalillo County, we found some SARs. For Otero County, also where Ruidoso is, there was no SARs, and Lincoln County, neither. So another way that people can really launder money back into Mexico was through the exportation of vehículos chocolates. You're probably all familiar with this. It's kind of almost like a trade-based money laundering scheme. You can buy a car or get a car here in the United States and import it into Mexico. And recently, there's been some regulatory reforms in Mexico to make that a little bit more difficult. And as you can see here, the car imports into Mexico in the last 7 years have decreased significantly. So that's, I think, positive in its own respect. But if, this whole thing is cat and mouse. And if you close one avenue, another one opens up. So if something's closing off here, is there another avenue opening up? And what could that look like? This is just an image of something that I wanted to share with you to demonstrate the kind of ways that dollar transactions are occurring here in the region. This is literally cut out of the newspaper from the classified sections for the purchase of a house in Juarez for dollars. And, supposedly that kind of transaction is supposed to be recorded. Is it? I don't know if it always is. Then we just did some data here on suspicious activity reports for El Paso County by type for 2017. And the predominant types up there at the top are suspicious use of multiple locations, individuals working together, and suspicions concerning the source of funds. And it's quite a long list here, and the amount of reports diminish in percentage terms rapidly. But nevertheless, we wanted to share that with you. Now, there's your total 68,000 reports so far this year to make 100%. Now, the other thing we did for Doña Ana County, and that list is shorter, but the same three elements are the same elements that we see in Doña Ana County. Now, and only 6,000 reports. So you go from 68,000 in El Paso to 6,000 in Las Cruces. And that's, I think, important to think about. We have some data here on suspicious activity. Vic's going to, drag me out here in a minute, so I won't belabor your patience either. But we have suspicious activity in El Paso County. We also have data on this for the Phoenix, Mesa, and Glendale metro areas, as well as the San Diego Carlsbad metro area as well. But I just included the El Paso and Doña Ana to focus on this region for the presentation. Oh, there's a twice. Okay, so now we're looking at sort of deposits and homicides. And you have deposits there in dollar terms on the left. So it goes from around 250 to 2007, right before the financial crash, to around 150, basically halves when the violence broke out. And then it's recovered somewhat by 2011. Now, so this shows sort of an inverse relationship between homicides and violence and deposits in Ciudad Juarez. So we're nearing the end of the presentation, but I really wanted to include this to show you, and not that any of us in this room need a reminder, but of the really destabilizing and detrimental effect that transnational money laundering can have on our communities. And it's not a victimless crime. It's something that is really not only destabilizing from a public safety point of view, but as we were mentioning earlier, is very much destabilizing from an economic well-being point of view and a social well-being point of view. Now, I want to share this with you because this is a satellite image of North America at night, and you'll see to the east the great density of infrastructure, cities, people that live there. And if for any of you who are as nerdy as I am about Western history or maps, there's something called the 100th meridian. And that kind of separates the arid west from the temperate and rainy east. And it goes basically through Oklahoma and central Texas. So to the west of the 100th meridian is basically an area of our continent and an area of our country for both Mexico and the United States that is yet to be developed. But the trade routes and the trade is pushing from the Atlantic, from the Gulf Coast, from the Midwest, through New Mexico into the Pacific as it has been for hundreds of years. So my point is that not only sort of are we on the front lines of current transnational and binational money laundering and public safety and national security issues, but temporally, we're also on the front line of a coming decade, a coming century of east-west market and infrastructure expansion that is only going to make our region not necessarily more vulnerable, but perhaps stronger for the insight and the expertise that we can share at the federal level in both private and public sector. Here we are again at the center of the continent, remembering where we are, remembering who we are, remembering how important it is for us to work together. Thank you so much for your patience today. I really appreciate your time and efforts. Again, if there's anything that we can help you with, please let us know. And thank you so much.